as a lot of people like to point out, I didn't come up the normal, you must go to this school, you must publish in these places, you must win these awards. And I am so happy to tell people and to have learned myself that a passion for the writing is all you really need. Mm.
Welcome, Patricia Smith, to this edition, my very first interview for Poetry.LA. Welcome to California.
It is quite an honor to be your first guest.
Well,
thank you, Lynn.
Thank you for saying yes. And I'd like you to kick us off this afternoon by reading a poem from your brand new collection, Unshuttered.
I'd be happy to. I think I have one that I've been thinking about. We had grown canny to the chase, the hunt, the metronome pursuit. They craved their due, their docile, bloodied trinkets, and they were mesmerized by maps of blood that they could coax at will to our skin. They wanted us to believe in a peculiar romance, their warped idea of love. You need our need of you. They even blessed us with their names. Lord, look upon their purity, their spewing of white grace, even as we lie prone beneath their stomp. But while you're blessing them, let them know how unwise it is to say, I am what Savior is to you, and expect us to believe. I am Josiah, my own Savior. I spent years persuading myself to this height and years stepping high to the rhythm of faith. I see their wretched love for what it is, a jumble of oily words practiced and delivered from wobbling pulpits, and I have grieved the many who listened and remade themselves in the image of those with the ruin of our hearts at heart. It's time the blackest among us realize that love never involved blared ownership of the body, that you are what Savior is to you.
Oh, so beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that with us. For our audience that may not be familiar with your new book, can you tell us in a sentence or two what the book is about?
For years, I started out with my husband. We would go to estate sales, tax sales, and we started collecting 19th century photos. I realized that I was seeing very few images of African Americans, and so I started to specialize in the collection of cabinet cards, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes. And I had them, at first, you know, poets love faces. And so I loved surrounding myself with them. And then they started to kind of speak to me a little bit, like, who might this person have been? I used them for a while as writing prompts when I was teaching at Cave Canem. And in my mind the whole time was, this would be a really great basis for a book. And I went through other things. Another book got in between, you know, and so the timing, it had to be just right, but they never went away. And so finally, this is a series of persona poems accompanied by those images.
Obviously, the photographs in some ways are as much of a centerpiece of the book as are the poems that they accompany. And I read somewhere that you had collected about 1,000 specifically of the African Americans, the vast majority of whom are unidentified. And I wondered what criteria you applied to ultimately choose the ones that ended up in the book.
I went through the photos many, many times. And some of them, because there's such a stoic quality to a lot of the photos, because you couldn't move, you know. So a lot of them looked kind of the same. When I thought about using them to write from, there's one image in the book where a very earnest young man is leaning a little bit into the camera with this wounded look on his face, and I said, oh, he's in love. He's in love and it's not being returned. Or there might be some element of grief in the face, or a peculiar pride. You know, like, I have reached a height where I'm able to sit for my own portrait. And then in other instances, you could tell that the portrait may have been taken because some property owner was cataloging, you know, the people who worked for him, and so there's this kind of resignation to some of the photos.
I think I heard someone ask you, whether or not whether you were comfortable, but the implication of the question was, you're making up stories about these people who had real lives, and you're not really, you're making up stories about what their lives were. Do you feel badly? There was something in the question that implied it was inappropriate for you to kind of put these stories juxtaposed with these photographs.
I got familiar with those type of questions when I wrote Blood Dazzler, my book about Hurricane Katrina. There was a lot of personification in that book, including personifying the storm, but also the fact that I was not from the Gulf region. I really don't have any relatives anymore from that region. And I experienced Katrina the same way everyone else did. You know, in the news, in the newspaper, you know.
Television.
Right, and so I think the job of a poet, the primary job of a poet is as witness. And it's really hard to put a boundary around what you witness. Okay, and I think the issue, and including with this book, is that it's not that you don't have the right to do it, it's that you need to answer to that right. You need to be able to say, this is what drove me to do this. It's serving a purpose, I believe. You know, now when people are trying so hard to take our histories away from us, any door that opens into an exploration of that history, maybe somebody picks up this book and starts to wonder about their own ancestors. Maybe someone picks up the book and says, wow, I didn't know that these kind of photos were available, and they start to trace their own history. You can say, why did you do this? And I have an answer. What happens too often is you'll ask someone, why did you do this? And they get defensive right away and say, because I have the right to do it. I'm an artist and I have, you know, and that's the problem. That's what gives rise to that question.
Kind of a question.
Like you're going to run roughshod over somebody's history or somebody's own story. So one of the things that I had happen, or made sure happen when I wrote the Katrina book, is I always wanted there to be a Q&A afterwards. Because I knew that it wasn't my territory, and that someone from New Orleans might say, that doesn't ring right, or something. I kept waiting for someone to challenge me on things, and no one really did until very, very later, and you know, AWP, big writing conference, lots of drinking. And it was at the bar, and someone looked at me and said, we had talk about you. And I said, oh, what, you know, well, we were wondering why you wrote about New Orleans. And she was the wife, she was a poet herself, but she was the wife of someone who worked for the paper there. And I finally got around to asking her, I said, was there anything wrong with the poems? Did I get anything wrong? Did I get anything wrong? Did you hate the poems? No, but, and I said, I love challenging myself when I'm writing. I'm thinking, okay, well, that's good, that's good. How can I complicate it? Because it keeps the writing interesting for me. So initially, I wanted to do strict Shakespearean sonnets, where I would end with one line and then start the next one with the next line. And so their stories had to kind of link a little bit. So I put them in that order. And that was entirely the wrong thing to do. If you're trying to unleash the voice of someone, you don't put it in a tight, regimented space like that. And they were, one of my mentors, Kwame Dawes, who looks at all my books, he said there was a dryness to some of them because you were trying so hard to link them, and you're letting the technique of it all overtake the voices, and you can't do that. So, and then I just opened all the poems up, and also there's always, whether poets like to talk about it or not, there's always kind of a narrative arc throughout a book. You talk about the short poems, the long poems, the funny poems, the not funny poems, the form poems, the free verse, that you don't want to get a string of poems that are all one, either technical thing, all one mood,
all bunched up together.
And so that also was in my mind, along with let some of the poems be funny, let some of the poems be romantic, let them be human. You know, let there be jealousy and vulnerability, and you know, and people who are just mistaken in their viewpoint. You know, let that. So that was important too. that people weren't allowed to say, oh, I'm opening a book of black people, so this is going to, you know,
Right,
this is going
exactly.
to be, you know,
Yeah.
and you want to break that expectation.
Would you grace the audience with another poem?
I would absolutely love to do that.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Poem I'm going to do is the first one in the book, which I mentioned a little bit. It's a little tiny tintype, and this is the one where the man was leaning forward just a little bit, with a little beseeching, a little grief, a little wanting, longing, and I said, this person is in love. And I wanted to start the book with this because I didn't want it to be a poem of the time. I didn't want to mention, you know, what age we were in or anything. I just wanted to say this is a universal poem because everybody's had their heart broken. You crush me with your damning glimpses, Anna. You, so rancorous, so wounding, and so cruelly bred to stain a man with scarring he won't see. Unsaid, my reckless want of you, this yearning, thirsting, blue inside these hands, is seed for malady, the mud that clogs my throat, a pantomime of moan and knees. Go home, you growl. I slip by agonized degrees into the sound. You mouth my name, unlatching flood. I beg you, Anna, search for mercy. Heave my hurt and humbled body close. Let pity drive your slight, unwilling hips into the waiting, sweated blight of mine. Let loose that rasping whisper. Shed your shirt and raise me slow, your mouth demolishing the rest of who I am until I gasp defeat against the firelight in your neck. I just can't see the sense in your bedevilment. What keeps you so possessed by wider gazes, dreaming you're the fool of those who'd ravish without wonder? Come home to the skin you know. Come staunch this mayhem with the medicine inside your sacred hold. Give me what you suppose that white man craves. Oh, Anna, drop me to my knees and call the shaming love. By now, I must have riled you past vexation into wanting. If not, I'll crouch here in blue, content to be your wreckage. Please.
There's so much that is beautiful about that poem. I
Oh,
think your
thank you.
instincts were correct to have it as the opening poem of the collection because it really draws you in, and it's just, I've read it several times, but to hear you speak it is just mesmerizing. And one of the things I'm fascinated by is your decision, or perhaps the speaker whispered her name, but Anna is so present in the poem, and I wondered, how did that come about?
She's very, very present there. And I think that one of the times I used this photo, as it is in the book, as a prompt, I said, now write her poem.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
write her poem. Because I look at poetry, especially persona poems, as having come from somewhere and going somewhere. And so we're privy really to that whole story, but we want to take a moment, it's like a photograph, and that's where the poem is.
Exactly.
But when you think about, I want another poem with this man, and you know, and so you take him to another space. You take him a year before or a year after. You take the white man is here in this poem too.
Absolutely.
Kind of this unseen presence in the whole thing, because he's questioning, what does he have beside whiteness that I don't have? So
Right.
there's a whole story that you could enter and re-enter time and time again and find new work there, a new poem.
It's hard for me to imagine the audience doesn't know who you are as a poet.
Not for me.
But for those few on the planet who say, who is this Patricia Smith with these amazing
Why should I listen
books?
to this?
Why should I listen to
tuned in
her?
to see Lynn Thompson.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background, the number of books you have, where you're working currently, all the good things that you want people to know about you.
I started out on stage. I was introduced to the world of the Poetry Slam. I started out with a very clear and evolving idea of audience and what you wanted the audience to feel because you could see their faces. And I think that's something I took into my writing. I was part of the Poetry Slam for years, and probably the greatest influence on my work and the way I think of how I want people to feel when they walk away from the poem. Mm-hmm. That has continued, whether they're reading the poem or listening to it. I started to get published, and a lot of people listening to this will probably know Louis Rodriguez.
Yes.
Louis Rodriguez I met in Chicago at the same time I was poetry slamming, started the wonderful Tia Chucha Press.
Yes.
At that time, and asked me if I had a manuscript. I like to tell everybody, when someone asks you if you had a manuscript, say yes, and then go home and worry about it because you don't have one.
Right.
Okay. But I did. So lucky to have met Louis at that time. Mm-hmm. And so my first book, which I have a love-hate relationship at this time. A lot of us have a love-hate relationship with our first books. Was very much the same things I was doing as a performer, with very little page discipline, which I hadn't developed yet. And so it's a great snapshot of where I was at the time. I've learned to love it for that reason. Mm-hmm. And from then, it was just being visible. I didn't, as a lot of people like to point out, I didn't come up the normal, you must go to this school, you must publish in these places, you must win these awards. And I am so happy to tell people and to have learned myself that a passion for the writing is all you really need. Mm-hmm. It's all you really need. If you are dedicated to the writing, and if you always have, I need to change something in my audience every time I read or write something. I need something that surprises them about the poetry. And that has worked really well, and I love it. I don't do strategizing. I don't, I just write. And so those first books, the first couple of books, I have 8 now. 9.
That's what I was going to ask.
8, 9, I don't know. And not all poetry books, but yeah, it came out of that. I decided when I did decide I wanted to do some studying to get an MFA, strictly because as a person known as a performer, I was being told a lot that there was part of poetry that didn't belong to me, that there was a part of the canon that I was not privy to, because I didn't have that grounding. And so I said, well, I'll go get the grounding. And I wanted to learn about form and prosody and meter and all those things, and I went specifically for that. The books, the first one was Life According to Motown. That was the one I did with Tia Chucha. And just to prove that it's where you are a lot of times and who's in the room. After that, I was just discovered by somebody who had a press in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They did my next 2 books. I got kind of a wider readership from that. And then as I learned more about poetry, and you can basically just trace it through the books, I got more disciplined. I developed more of a sense of who the reader was as opposed to who the listener was. But it was a great melding of what I had learned in spoken word and what I could bring to now the classical page, because I got to bring meter with that same kind of contemporary spoken feel to it. The first book that I think got me known on a wider scale was probably Shoulda Been Jimi Savannah, which I think of as a kind of a poetic memoir in a way. And it's also the first time I think I had enough nerve to turn back and take a really close look at my own life. Mm-hmm. That comes late to a lot of poets, but that got the Lenore Marshall Prize from the Academy, and I was like, what, really, huh, what? And then all of a sudden people were like, okay, who is this person? I think that recognition kind of changed my idea of audience again, but didn't change my writing at all. And so then after that, no, wait, let me see. Tea House of the Almighty came before that, and then Jimmy Savannah, and then Blood Dazzler. And Blood Dazzler changed me a lot because it was the first book that took one event and had the whole book circle around that event. And that wasn't something I ever thought I would be able to do.
Would you agree that Blood Dazzler enabled you or had an impact on writing Incendiary Art, which was the book that you won the Kingsley Tufts for?
In Blood Dazzler, I looked for a long time very closely at very disturbing things, including the overarching question, oh my God, what else is this country capable of?
Yes.
And that was a very sobering moment for me and led me to look at other things that were being discussed so much that they weren't being discussed.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
you understand that, right? So I said, we need to, one thing I often mentioned in my teaching is I'm going to be more affected looking in another person's eyes than I am looking at a concept or an issue. Or, okay, so show me a mother who has just lost her son.
Right.
Don't talk to me about the proliferation of the shootings or
Right.
oh my God, it's happened again. Give me that woman and make me look at her.
Right.
And I think in Blood Dazzler, I got that idea that the closer I can move the lens in, the bigger story I can tell, which doesn't really gel the way you think it would, you
Right.
know. And so that gave me the idea, who's the person that we're not hearing in these stories of all these lost lives? And often it's the mother. You know, it's you don't want to hear her.
Right.
You're trying to move
Right.
past her as soon, because that reminds you that you are as human as the person who is gone.
But I also have a little bird that told me that there might be a novel in the works.
Tweet, tweet.
And tweet, tweet. And I am wondering, can we, your very excited audience, anticipate seeing that novel in the not too distant future?
Actually, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to speak it into existence right here.
Oh, I'm glad to break the story.
Yeah, I've been talking to a number of poets about my time. I think there's a quality that I have that I think came out of the spoken word thing, where I believe that if I am not visible all the time doing something, that I'm not vital. Or
Right.
that people are going to forget that I exist. And that's been unproven so many times.
Right.
That I am now really concentrating on clearing out my space, because I will never forgive myself if I don't get the novel done.
Right.
I wondered for a long time, could I do a novel? I've done a short story that won an award, and I was really happy about that, much to my husband's chagrin. I wrote a little crime story, and it was, you know, people loved it, and I said, huh. So, yes, I'm working on a novel.
Does it feel different as a creative person to work on the prose of a novel? I mean, I know you've written prose poems, of course, and a few short stories, but does that feel different, or is it all of a piece? I'm a writer. It's like the poet that writes formally one day and writes free verse the next day. Is that the feeling, or something else altogether?
So I thought I needed to take fiction classes.
Yes.
Oh, how to write a novel, 10 steps to writing, you know, I was like,
Right.
okay. And I took these fiction things and all of the exercises that we had, and then we would read what we'd written, and people would go, how did you do that? And they think that they had discovered this new, you know, form of prose, and I said, But then I realized we are so used to writing these sloppy, unwieldy stories in these tight controlled spaces. So every word has to do work.
Exactly.
And that's something you take along with you when you're writing prose.
Exactly.
That's why we're seeing Ocean Vuong in his novel. And, you know, we're seeing these people, these poets, transform. They're moving really easily into prose. And I'm
prose.
talking it up everywhere because I'd love to see more of that.
Will you close us out with a final poem?
So there is another little tintype in here, And the odd thing about it, there are two women very formally dressed, and it looks like they're really trying hard not to look directly at each other, not to look at the camera. And it seems that we've caught this at the moment when one can't help herself, and she looks at the other one. But they're facing in different directions, and you'll see what I mean. But
Okay.
And this is another time when I thought, I don't want to write about the time. I'm looking at this and going, why are they not looking directly at each other? And this is what I came up with. We ache for fiction etched in black and white. Our eyes never touch. These tragic grays and bustles, mourners' hats plopped high upon our tamed but tangled crowns, strain to disguise what yearning does with us. The white man sputters, angered by our stiff distance. Drape your right arm there, over her shoulder. Move! Move in closer. Your cousins, sisters, servants in the same house? Why stand so far apart, like strangers? Here! Paralyzed, mute, I try to crush the memory of your mouth's sly moonlit trip down a trail to the center of this body. Just another complication I will have to die to forget. And I cannot move my hand, so terrified am I of unleashing the howl it must conceal when your swept glance, that's it, now look at her, thunders in my neck. I want this done. I want to own this flat, fixed sentence of tin so that everyone can take as gospel this chilled restraint, and we can just keep on whisper living our lush life, which we will whenever the night, our blacker sister, indulges us and cloaks the moon.
Gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for gracing us at Poetry.LA. I know that the audience is going to love this interview. It's been terrific. Thank you.
Thank you for having me as your first guest, and it's always a joy to talk to you.